Hello, everyone. I am joined once again by Victor Mangarino. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, it's one of the standard in
Okay.
interpretations of my surname.
Good. All right. I'll take it. And of course, we're going over Philosophy Tube's video on Confucius. Nope. And my phone is going off. On Confucius, which I'm going to say in advance actually isn't the most terrible thing I've seen. There are problems with it, which we'll get into. But there are actually some good points made in it. But it'll be interesting to go through and, pick it apart. So, because Victor, you actually have an education that has dealt with Confucius in some detail.
Yes. So over at NYU Shanghai, I took a couple of courses on Chinese philosophy, and in particular, I took one that focused more on Confucianism with a professor that is called Tong Dong Bai. He's really popular within the sphere of Confucian thinking and so on and so forth. And he was a really nice professor. I learned a lot from him. So hopefully, I will be able to share a little bit of the knowledge and try to shed some light into these questions, which I don't think that they were treated too poorly in this video. Okay, but I do think that there are some.
When I told all my friends that I was making a video to teach people about Confucius, they all.
Oh, hang on. Why is it playing now? Sorry, that was weird.
So
go on.
So I'm just saying that I think there are some half-truths, some things that could be extended on a little bit deeper, some things that were covered a little bit, not too properly. So I'm not an expert, obviously, on this subject, but I do think that I have some knowledge. And, we're going to look at it through a critical lens, but we're not going to be doing this in a sort of destructive way. I want to do this more in a way that, in a sense, brings, good content into the table without being too mediatic, too strong in the criticisms or anything of the sort. So hopefully we will all enjoy this conversation.
Yeah, and I think, and just by way of starting off on a positive note, I think one thing that you and I both agreed before this started, she does really well, is she points out, parodies very effectively, the way in which certain kinds of commenters on Chinese philosophy, or whatever you want to call it, disparage it on the grounds that the texts don't seem to demonstrate sort of the same kind of rigor and logical structure, and sort of the show your reasoning nature of Western philosophy, quote unquote. Despite the fact, of course, that like some of the greatest mainstays of that are equally, exemplars of not well displaying your logic, often intentionally, in the text, people like Plato. They'll treat it as if it's somehow inferior or not true philosophy. And I think what happens is people mistake the activity of philosophy with the genre of philosophical writing that we're used to. So, I mean, of course, like here's my, very distinguished $5 gift copy from Chapters of the Analects. When you read this, it doesn't read like what we tend to see in examples of what we call Western philosophy. It's a series of sayings or suggestions or just sort of like he just tells you things. And there isn't a reasoning process there in most cases. But the reasoning process produced that. Confucius himself was a philosopher. The book, however, is not a book of philosophy. It's a book of the products of his philosophy. So I think what ends up happening is there's a strange attempt to find an equivalent between a very specific cultural product, like, say, something like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, with the cultural products of some other culture somewhere. You say, okay, where is there Kant? Well, there isn't one, because that was a particular thing that happened in a particular time and place to address particular conditions that simply weren't applicable in that time. The problems that Confucius is addressing are not the problems that Kant was addressing. And that is borne out in the fact that their solutions were different. He had to write a different kind of thing to address them, or at least he thought he did at the very least. So I think one thing she does very well is she points out that, like, this is not how you do it. This isn't how you judge the merits of a philosophical system. You don't look at the the artifacts associated with it and then condemn the thought as if these two were one-to-one. Like a sentence of Plato is not philosophy. It has philosophical import, but it is not the same thing as the activity of philosophy. I don't know if you have any thoughts to that before we want to go in, but
yeah. So my main thought here would be that we need to understand the philosophical, the intellectual products of every society and in every given time from the material circumstances of those societies of those times. Okay, and this is something that Tom Dombay does really nicely at the beginning of his course, of the course that I took with him, and at the beginning of his last book, which is basically describe what was going on at the time of Confucius and what happened beforehand, and what is Confucius, in a sense, reacting to when he's developing his philosophy, and what are the conditions of his time. Because, philosophy wasn't developed as an academic field in the time of Confucius. We're talking about hundreds of years before Christ, okay? And we're talking about China, which is a society completely different to the societies that we see in Europe or in America. So that's why, in a sense, we need to understand each, let's say, intellectual field from its own standing point, okay, from its own grounds. We need to understand its history. We need to understand the material circumstances that led to it. And to be honest, the insights of Confucius are really important, and even today have many good applications. Maybe we will discuss some of them here in the future. I want to discuss many more of those, and I think that philosophy too has, in a sense, the spirit of trying to apply to the present world some of the philosophy of Confucius in order to solve some of the problems that we have. But in the end, she ends up, staying more at the level of certain cliches, not actually being able to provide these, like applications. And this is some of the limitations that I found with her video. But I do think that her main, her main theme that seems to be in a sense, here in the West, we believe that we have the best philosophical products, and we have very good philosophical products. I'm not saying that the West doesn't do philosophy properly. I think that we do really good philosophy. But I'm saying that, in a sense, we tend to underestimate the level of philosophical thinking of other cultures, and philosophy too does a really nice job at satirizing this attitude, okay, and the norms and the, in a sense, the conventions, okay, that we have here in the West, satirizing them to say, okay, we are not let's say perfect either. So let's try to be honest, and let's try to be fair with these traditions of philosophical thinking, and let's try to give them their due respect.
Yeah, and she does a great job of that, as you say in the start, and then she kind of, I don't know what happened. I think she just had to wrap it up, and she kind of lost her own plot, because at the end of it, she just goes, well, it doesn't work. And it's really disappointing after the really strong start. I have a lot of criticisms of Philosophy Tips Project generally, but I think this is actually, on the whole, or maybe about 50%, actually really solid. But I think we should probably just get into it, so we have something concrete to respond to.
Yeah, let me put my earplugs here before we start, so that there's no echo or anything of the sort.
All right. Good to go?
Okay. Yes, I am.
Let's do it. That's a cool effect.
When I told all my friends that I was making a video to teach people about Confucius, they all had the exact same response. They all said, ooh, that sounds interesting. I've heard of Confucius, but I don't know anything about it. And I was like, yeah, me neither. When I did my philosophy degree, nobody taught us about Confucius, but he's part of the cultural legacy of like a third of the world's people. So I thought that alone is a good enough reason to take a look. But the more I researched and read, the more I realized that Confucius is actually incredibly relevant to everything that's going on in the world right now. He was born at the tail end of the Zhou dynasty in 551 BC, so absolutely ages ago. And they had a big problem back then, which was that society was slowly falling apart. China, as we know it, did not exist yet. It was a bunch of semi-independent states run by noble families. And officially, they ruled on behalf of the king, but like, nah. They had a fully sophisticated government structure with different ministers and departments and officials, and they had a whole load of rules. But at the same time, if you were rich enough, you could kind of just do whatever, and nobody could stop you. Like in Confucius's home state of Lu, the Zhang family were officially in charge, but everybody knew you don't cross the Ji family. The Ji family did all the important sacrifices. The chief minister was always mysteriously from the Ji. They threw all the biggest parties, and they hired their own security. And eventually, this massive
can you stop it
corruption
there?
and open.
So this is already a very fair analysis, more or less, of the situation in which Confucius was at. So we need to understand here that Confucius is often seen as a conservative, okay, as a person who wanted to preserve something about the past. And what is it about the past that he wanted to preserve? Well, we're going to deal, okay, with this topic now, but in a sense, he saw, okay, they have all of these mythical stories about the sage kings, okay, who were a certain set of people in the past, some of which, whose existence is not really that well historically, corroborated, but that nevertheless were important for the mythical stories that they told themselves back in the day, yeah. And basically, what he wanted to preserve was the old feudal. Okay, this is even how Tong Dongbai defines the system of the Zhou dynasty. The old feudal system of organizing the Chinese society at the time, which was not, China as we understand it today, obviously. And he wanted to preserve the structures that led to it being such a great and such a strong nation, such a strong society that, in a sense, had a lot of the features that Confucius wanted to see. But nevertheless, Confucius was not just an old school authoritarian, an old school conservative. He was really, in a sense, progressive in some instances, because he redefined the way in which the old system, okay, the old feudal system worked, and the ways in which we conceive it, they conceived it, okay, they redefined it in a way so as to make it, more applicable to the time where he was living, which was a time where that old system was disintegrating, okay, through a set of wars, through a set of economic struggles. There was, in fact, a disintegration of the Zhou dynasty that was taking part at the time, and then the period started of the Warring States, okay, the Warring States period, which was a period of great wars against, the big and the not so big states that formed the Zhou dynasty back in the day before that time. And in a sense, what happened here was that these states became very large. Some states became very large, very populous, and they were disintegrating. There was conflict, there was distrust, there was mistrust. Okay, there were many moral decay. What today we could call this almost a conservative concept of moral decay. There was all of these phenomena, okay, that occurred at a time where the material basis of the society in which they lived was, in a sense, falling apart. And what happened at that time is that people needed to give answers, but not the old answers to how should our society be organized, who should be the ruler, what should bond people together. Okay, they needed to give new answers because the old answers weren't working anymore. The old answers were the feudal answers. Okay, why should you be the king? Well, because I am the son of X, who was the person that ruled over this particular territory, and I inherited the property over this particular land, and that's why I should be the king. Okay, what should connect people together? Well, the rights, okay, the li, what she's going to call the li, the different set of norms, of customs. Okay, that's what keeps people together in the past, but no longer was that a good answer. And she's not going to give a very good impression of how Confucius presented a new notion of what should be the bondage that keeps people together in this new society. Okay, because it's not Li, it's something else. Li is part of it, but it's not the full of it. It's not even the most important part of it. That's what I'm going to be explaining now. But she is doing, a fairly good job at describing a little bit what the situation was. And this is already a good thing, okay? Because we start from the context and then we move to the ideas. That is really important. That is the way in which I think we should proceed when looking at these questions.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on this, but I actually want to let her get into that first, because I think a lot of really interesting stuff actually sort of comes out of Confucius that implies at a much earlier stage, oddly enough, not like in an explicit and like coherent and intentional form, but there are elements implied that sort of, in a sense, almost precede Aristotelian and even Hobbesian thinking later on. But we'll keep going.
Open contempt for the rules of society by the people at the top started threatening the whole system. People got sick of it. They were like, well, why should we follow the rules if the bloody G family don't have to? But there wasn't anything they could do about it from within the system. So it looked like there was no solution that didn't involve violence. And into this mess is born Confucius. And he says, lads, I think I know how to fix this.
See, this is. Can you stop it there? This is the pop philosophy part of this. Okay, obviously,
Yeah.
we didn't do that. Obviously, Confucians didn't do that, but we need to be careful here
That hurt my
with
soul.
how we treat this, because Confucius never said, "Lads, I know how to fix this." Okay, but as a simplification, maybe it has a little bit of accuracy. But I don't know if this music is copyrighted. Maybe it is. Maybe not.
I don't think it is, because if it was, then she would be demonetized.
Well, maybe she has the
Well,
copyright.
let's look. Let's see. Oh my God. Well, you know what? If they demonetize this, that's fine. It's not making any money anyways.
Well, so long as they don't take the stream
I
down.
don't. I do not think they will. I haven't had that problem so far. If I can use
Okay.
Disney's music and not get my stream taken down, we'll be okay.
Dishes on my table, I gotta do something about it. Do something. 录进小口，竖起背头，食物垃圾分类回收，洗碗也泡进水中。雾里朦胧飘散也有味。
The oldest source we have for Confucius's ideas is a book called The Analects, which is also my primary source for today. It's divided into short books and chapters, each of which is a little saying. The master said, "The gentleman is easy of mind, while the small man is always full of anxiety."
Can we stop it here? for a
The
second?
master
So, what does Confucius mean by gentleman? Because she doesn't. She never explains what he means by this. So, this is one of those redefinitions, okay, of Confucius and of the Confucians of the time. Because back in the day, back in the Zhou dynasty, gentleman was just the noble title of somebody who is by society's let's say the structure of society. It is a gentleman because they have the title of being a gentleman because of the structure. Now, the way in which the Confucians redefined this notion of gentleman was gentleman is anyone that acts like a gentleman, anyone that behaves like one, anyone that has the knowledge of a gentleman. Okay, that is what gentlemen were at his time. Okay, noblemen, and that's why Confucius himself was a gentleman, because Confucius didn't come from a very noble family. He had in the past certain ancestors who were more noble than not, but then his father was not a very well-established person at all, and he had to do menial labor in his childhood. Confucius, and there's a quote in the Analects where he discusses with a person that is of higher rank this concept of I know where the other person is praising him for being able to do certain things with his hands, okay, because normally noble people didn't do menial labor, but Confucius knew how to do it because he wasn't noble in that sense of being born in a family of noble people, but he was a gentleman because he behaved like one. He had the knowledge of one. He, in a sense, educated people into being a gentleman because he had the manners of a gentleman.
Which is
So that's
which
one
is
of those
sort of
redefinitions.
yeah, which has a certain resonance, because there's a lot of that's almost a character type in Chinese history. Like you think of Cao Mengdi, who was the son of a eunuch and was of relatively low stature compared to other ministers prior to becoming. Was he the king of? Was it Wei? I can't remember, but like that seems to be a trend in sort of the history of Chinese, not necessarily philosophy per se, but just Chinese critical thought of any, not in the modern sense of critical thought, but Chinese reflective, theoretical thinking in general, is that it was generally people who came from positions of either extremely low stature, relatively speaking, or people who were who had basically failed at some critical juncture and were sort of very, very low down for a period. That's really where you get like these really complicated and nuanced and interesting sort of strategic and political texts, is from people who, for whatever reason, were now unable to enact their policies in practice, or their I guess it's really difficult to talk about this without sort of deploying terms we use to describe elements of what we call Western philosophy. But just for argument's sake, it really does seem to be an activity performed specifically by people who have been beaten in some way. And that does actually sort of seem to be the difference between Confucius and a lot of his contemporaries, is that he was critical of people who, in fact, did actually manage to hold on to power. I mean, not hold on to the unity of their kingdom, but hold on to power. Whereas he himself was chased into the wilderness, and yet he's the one who's concerned with the stability of the kingdom. So.
Yeah, I mean, so Confucius had political, in a sense, motivations, and he wanted to be, and he worked for a little bit as an advisor, okay, to certain royal figures, but he never really had a really strong, a really well-defined political career, like Han Feize, for example, who we are going to talk a little bit about toward the end. Okay, that's why one of the things, okay, that normally critics of Confucius says is, yeah, I mean, Confucius was very good about talking about really abstract, really nice, moral things, but he wasn't as pragmatic, okay, and he didn't have a really prolific, in a sense, political career, okay. But he nevertheless had a really strong impact into Chinese culture and into the ways in which a lot of royal figures in many different dynasties, and even in the Warring Straits period, did the things that they did. So he had a lot of influence there, but he nevertheless had no very strong and very well-defined and very successful political career as other people in the legalist school, for example.
One person in the comments just asked, wasn't Confucius the Chinese version of Aristotle? And I was about to bring something of that sort up, and that there's a lot
of a Socrates more than an Aristotle.
Think so?
But yes, but like this is obviously a really rough comparison. We cannot really do this. Okay, this is just like almost just for the jokes, because obviously you cannot.
I mean, in a sense, but I actually think there is some useful point of comparison here. Aristotle, of course, is writing about how virtue can maintain the best polis after Athens has sort of been diminished, first by the Peloponnesian War and the rule of the tyrants, and then by the empire of the Macedonians. I mean, there's a whole lot of this, especially the talk of the gentleman and of good politics being downstream of virtuous rulers. I mean, there's of course resonances in Plato's Socrates as well, but there definitely does seem to be sort of an implicit virtue ethics here, or something that we could describe as such. But yeah, let's keep going.
Yeah.
Said, the gentleman understands what is moral. The small man understands what is profitable. The master said, a goo that is not a proper goo, is it really a goo? Is it really a goo? The Analects was put together decades or possibly centuries after Confucius died, allegedly by his disciples. There are later books attributed to him or in which he appears as a character, but as far as we know, we don't have anything written by the man himself at time of recording. I say at time of recording because one of the awesome things about ancient philosophy is we could find a Zhou dynasty tomb tomorrow with some scrolls in it that totally revolutionizes everything we think we know about Confucius.
I have a quick question about this. I was under the impression that Confucius was responsible for, or at least was recorded as being responsible for, compiling a lot of the classical Chinese historical texts. Is that sort of is that a contested understanding, or what is that?
I mean, Confucius certainly didn't write the things that are attributed to him. Okay, so those are recollections. That's why normally many passages in the Analects start with "and the master said." Okay,
Yeah.
because he wasn't writing them himself. Okay, but he was a scholar, and he certainly was in possession of many, let's say, manuscripts, okay, of the times before him, and he had a lot of knowledge about the ideas of previous thinkers. So he certainly did, in a sense, recollect a lot of those, and then made his own opinions. But he didn't write or compile in the modern sense of what compiling means. These things.
The whole field can and does change overnight. People have been writing commentaries on the Analects for thousands of years, and every commentator brings their own spin to it as a result of the context they're living in. That includes, by the way, me. So just bear in mind that the true meaning of the text, if there is such a thing, is not as interesting as what we can do with it now. Even his name,
can you stop
Confucius, is a...
So there's a little bit of truth here, but I don't really think that. I think she's been too skeptical with how much we can understand what Confucius meant and what he thought. Okay, now that's why there's been a lot of philosophical work. Many scholars have done a lot of work on Confucius. Even to this day, there's debates going on and so on and so forth. But it's not, it's not a field of everything is questioned. We don't really know. We're just making, pragmatic interpretations to today's world. Not necessarily, okay? So there's a little bit of truth there, because it is indeed correct that you could, in fact, interpret certain things in different ways. And especially because she's going to speak a little bit about this, the different characters mean different things. And there's potential here for, having, in a sense, different opinions and giving different interpretations for different parts of history, okay? But I nevertheless think that we can in fact have a good understanding of at least many of the things that Confucius certainly believed and certainly said and certainly advocated for in the day, and that we have grounds on building, in a sense, somewhat of a system, of a philosophical system based upon that. Okay, that's what many people have been doing for the years. And okay, there has been many different Confucians with, in some instances, opposing views. Okay, but this is not an unsettled field as she's making it out to be. Okay, we can indeed make certain statements and say certain things and have certainty about quite a lot of things here. Okay, although it's not perfect, of course.
A later interpretation. It's actually a Latinization of Kong Fuji, which means...
So that's a really bad pronunciation.
What's that?
Okay, that's a really bad pronunciation, but we're going to forgive her for that. So normally, okay, so I don't have the best pronunciation either, but I have studied Chinese. So this is one of the things when I studied Chinese that I struggled most with, because I have a really strong personal Spanish accent when I speak English and when I speak any other language. But Chinese is obviously nevertheless a thing that I really tried, okay, to get the accent right. And I was there with my professors, like struggling in office hours, trying to pronunciate things properly. Now, my pronunciation of this would be Kung Fu Zi, okay? Or normally you abbreviate it to Kung Zi.
Really?
Okay, but it's not G. There's no G there. That last character that you say here is Zi. So normally you say Kung Zi.
Kung Zi.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but like somebody in the comment maybe finds that I pronounce something different than what it actually is. Okay, in that case, I don't want to be here like the expert on Chinese pronunciation, because I'm certainly not. But at least I tried. Okay, I tried when I studied Chinese to get the pronunciation right.
That's okay. It's a karma for me not being able to pronounce your last name.
Wrong. So before we get to anything else, obviously this was written in Chinese. What the hell is a gu? Now, the Cambridge Chinese to English Dictionary defines gu as, "We have stolen your dictionary, nerd. Send us Bitcoin if you ever want to see it again." But even knowing that definition, it still feels like I'm missing some context. To be fair, Plato and Aristotle, or any of the other ancient philosophers that get studied a lot in the West,
That was good.
didn't write in modern English either.
Yeah.
But Chinese can be especially tricky because it doesn't have an alphabet the way English or ancient Greek do. Take the English word alphabet. We know that A means an A sound. L is a L sound, PH is F. So you see the whole word and you go alphabet, right? Chinese characters, on the other hand, do not represent sounds. They represent syllables and occasionally entire words. The advantage of this system is you can write a lot of information in just a tiny amount of space. European monks are writing out the Bible one letter at a time on vellum. Meanwhile, in China, I've made 500 copies and written a novel before I've even had lunch. One scroll, bam, done. And get this, spelling changes a lot faster than characters do. Ever tried to read the Canterbury Tales? Fucking incomprehensible. And that was only written 600 years ago. Whereas if you know traditional Chinese characters, you can find an ancient scroll in a tomb and read it. But the downside is this. This character means electricity, or thunderstorm, or lightning, or electric. And this means brain, which itself is a combination of characters including flesh, clever, and think. Put the two together and you have
Clever thunderstorm flesh that thinks.
or
Smart fine thinking electric meat.
or electric brain or computer. This is
Okay, so can you stop it
it's
here?
just the Chinese word for
So this is Dian Now. This is the word that we're looking at here, Dian Now, which is the Chinese word for computer. So that's why you need to rely sometimes, a lot of times actually, on context in order to understand what certain characters mean. Okay, when you're reading a text, you need to, in a sense, understand the context in order to be able to interpret properly some of the characters, because they do, in fact, some characters are either very similar or exactly the same, but yet have different meanings. Okay. So that's why normally you need to be careful, but this is not, a problem where suddenly you cannot understand Chinese. Okay, like I think she's being a little bit too skeptical with how much we can understand traditional Chinese. And she's putting this word as an example, but anyone, okay, that knows Chinese is going to tell you this is a computer. Anyone, okay, I know this for myself. So this is not a thing where if you give this to a Chinese person, it's not going to be like, what do you mean exactly? They're going to tell you, okay, this is a computer. You know what I mean? Like, she's making it out to be a little bit too much of an issue, when in reality it's not that much of an issue. Like, traditional Chinese is a really nice, really complex, but at the same time really let's say elegant language. And the modern version of Chinese, okay, which is the simplified version, it's really practical. It's really nice to read. It's really nice to speak, and it's really nice to write as well. It's easier to write than the traditional Chinese. And this was made, I believe it was made in a sense purposefully in order to make a unified Chinese that applied to all of the different regions in China, because that they have different dialects there. So they try to,
and you're dealing with empires that span massive swaths of territory, so that government was practically impossible. If you want to manage economics at any scale, you needed some kind of universal form of communication that didn't have like these radical dialectical shifts between regions. And so they overcame that by having like no sound. It's purely abstract. Let's keep going.
computer. Can you guess the problem? Philosophy tends to use extremely technical and specific language, and occasionally invents entirely new concepts. And if you're translating, you want to capture the nuances without making it cumbersome, like clever thunderstorm flesh that thinks. So there's a lot of haggling over precise wording. Here's a controversial example. Analects 4:15 says, "The way of the master consists in zhong and shu." That is all. Okay, good to know. If we can figure out what zhong and shu mean, then we've cracked it. So, what do they mean? Well, zhong has been translated as loyalty, respect, reverence, doing your best, and devotion, among other things. And shu has been translated as reciprocity, altruism, forgiveness, consideration, and occasionally the entire phrase, "do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Okay. The Cambridge Chinese to English Dictionary defines shu as, "Seriously, if you ever want to see your dictionary again, transfer Bitcoin by tomorrow," which again is a completely different meaning. For the last 2.5.
Okay, I do have some issues with this, but I will say that the comedy here is top notch. I don't know. I feel like she's pointing out a problem in translation, not so much an inherent difficulty in understanding the text. Because I think just a lot of translators are very careless. We see this a lot in Aristotle studies, where people will try to render polis or politeia in language that is easily accessible to lay people. So they'll translate it as city, or as or maybe like some neutral term. They'll try to call politeia because it's disputed how far you can carry that term into the future. They'll call it polity, like some sort of generic, this is a political thing, we're going to call it polity. Everywhere is polity. So what are polities? Just political things. And that seems to be sort of the philosophy of translation undergirding a lot of these translations. And the goal is to render it, again, accessible to a lay readership rather than to accurately convey its meaning and context. Now, if you have a critical edition of the text, typically it will supply context and you'll get that broader meaning. But I don't think this is that much of an issue here. But that's being a bit pedantic, I think.
5,000 years, different philosophers have had subtly different interpretations, to the point where if you pick up a copy of the Analects today, it might seem weird and even contradictory, because it could be a mishmash of different translations. Some people have even turned around and blamed Chinese philosophers for being vague and weird, when really the problem could be that the text has been distorted.
The Chinese never had a secular enlightenment, and that's why you can't understand a bloody word they're saying. Chinese philosophers simply never had the rigorous commitment to logic and truth that their counterparts did in the West.
And the fun doesn't stop there. Let's say we translate zhong as...
I actually want to go into that one a little bit, because yeah, there is a really inappropriate way in which people will criticize "quote unquote" Eastern philosophy as not having
absolutely
truth. Yeah, and the parody is correct. At the same time, we want to be careful, because even in the word philosophy itself, there are cultural and metaphysical commitments that don't necessarily carry over on a one-to-one basis. Mm-hmm. So like when you think of philosophy, you think of love of Sophia, right? Like it's quite literally in the term. Socrates himself was understood to be a sophist, just a purveyor of wisdom, or of, it meant in a more sarcastic mode, a purveyor of, dialectical skill or something like that, or rhetorical skill rather. Confucius isn't primarily concerned with cultivating a love of wisdom, but with cultivating virtue for the sake of the well-being of the kingdom, which is different. It's not it definitely goes into the realm of philosophy. He touches on stuff that makes it very amenable and equivalent in many respects, but it is still a separate project, which does not mean subsidiary or not subsidiary, which does not mean beneath it or or in some sense underneath philosophy. It's still like a high level, but it's almost a different project, because we tend to naturalize philosophy as being this thing that just everybody does, and we can find people doing philosophy in any culture, but the specific activity that he is doing in this, it's not the same thing as what Aristotle is doing in his Ethics, even though you can derive a lot of the same sorts of thinking from it. It's a lot more specific than that, and I worry sometimes with a lot of these understandable attempts to reassert the value of Eastern philosophy against Western philosophy, that it ends up sort of brushing over its actual particular nuances in order to reconstrue it as philosophy in the sense of Western philosophy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, more or less. So the thing here is that so whether or not Chinese philosophical thinking is or not a philosophy, especially Confucianism, for example, depends really on what your definition of philosophy is. Now, generally, I believe that those definitions that encompass these traditions of thinking, like Confucianism, within the idea of what philosophy is, are generally better at describing what we are trying to aim at, with this word, than definitions that exclude it, because it generally does feel like a philosophy. And this is why, for example, Tong Dong-bai, who studied for many years in the United States, had to, in a sense, struggle a lot with people in this, Western chauvinist philosophical thinking that, in a sense, smeared at Chinese philosophy and looked at it as, a lot of pseudo-religious nonsense. And he had to defend a lot of his Confucian views, and he had to defend a lot of the tradition of Chinese philosophical thinking. And so he defined philosophy in such a way that, in a sense, incorporated this thinking. And his definition, okay, if you want, I can give it to you. Now, it's been a while since I heard it or read it, but I'm going to give you a rough description of how Tong Dong-bai defines philosophy, because I think it's a fair definition of it. And he defines it as a field of thinking, okay, that is reflexive, okay, and that is reflective, where you reflect on things and you sit and think deeply about certain things about human experience, and it is in a sense perpetually progressing field. There's no end to philosophy. There are no solutions, hard solutions to philosophical problems, because they're always being debated, and there's always new and better and higher analytical stages being developed within the philosophical framework. So this is how he defines a philosophy.
And furthermore, as it's developing, what we understand to be philosophy is changing too. So like, if and this is where it gets tricky, because the point I made notwithstanding, if we then regard Confucius as not a philosopher, as you say, we would, to be consistent, have to regard most of who we would consider to be founders of Western philosophy also to be not philosophers.
Pretty much.
Yeah. And again, it's like it's identifying philosophy as an activity, and as an activity that sort of transforms itself as it develops, not as a genre of texts. Like philosophy is not this thing that was manufactured in a printing press. It's an activity that conscious beings do.
And it is reflective. This is the important thing.
Yeah.
That it is sitting and thinking about certain things very hard, and struggling with those ideas and fighting other people in a dialectical sense, and getting to higher analytical stages through that dialectical struggle. Now, this is the important part, obviously, of philosophy, and this is something that, if you define philosophy as being this, not as a systematized way of looking at certain metaphysical, moral, or whatever points of view, and it is systematized, you need to present highly structured, formal, logical arguments, and so on and so forth. Now, this is the modern conception of philosophy, and anyone that studies philosophy today, especially at good philosophical institutions, knows that this is in a sense how philosophy is done today. You need to structure your arguments really well. You need to be able to, in a sense, defend each premise, show how it logically leads to a certain conclusion, how the entire argument is valid and sound, all of that. Now, this obviously is not the way in which they did it, but this doesn't exclude the Chinese from having a philosophy. Mm-hmm. And this is the important part about Tong Dong-bai's definition of philosophy, which is really, really good because it encompasses that rigorous, formal way of looking at philosophy, but at the same time, it also encompasses the not so rigorous, but nevertheless still highly intuitive philosophical way of approaching issues, and it also considers that as being a philosophy. So the Confucians were philosophers. So the Confucians, in a sense, the ones that did Confucianism, like Confucius, Sun Tzu, and many others, okay, they were philosophers because they, in a sense, did this. They reflected on things. They thought about them really hard, things about human experience, okay, about society, about morality, and so on and so forth. And they fought against each other in this dialectical sense, and sometimes even in actual, warfare conflicts. And they improved upon certain notions. They developed different ideas, and so on and so forth. And this is, the essence of philosophy that these thinkers also captured. That's why they should also be considered philosophers.
Let's keep going.
Devotion. Okay, Confucius wants us to be devoted to what, though? To other people? To the country? To tradition? You've kind of got to read the rest to figure it out. And that only multiplies the problem. And Shu, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. You might recognize that phrase from the Bible, or the Torah, or the Hadith. It's the so-called golden rule of morality. And there's a lot of argument over how exactly you're supposed to translate it. Is it do unto others as you would have them do unto you? Or is it do not do to others what you wouldn't want them to do to you? Because those are not the same thing. The first one is actually a lot more demanding. If I have to do unto you what I would want, then I have to help you when you're in trouble. But if it's just, hey, don't treat anybody how you wouldn't want to be treated, then, well, all I have to do is leave you alone. There's been a lot of argument about whether Confucius's golden rule is the easy version or the hard version. Some people have said it's definitely the easy one, and that's evidence for Chinese ethics somehow not being as good. The Chinese never had a secular enlightenment, which is why they're all a bunch of heartless bastards. Unlike Great Britain, the most ethical country the world has ever known. But there's also a pretty convincing case to be made that the man himself wouldn't have made that distinction in the first place. And just to put the cherry on the top, Analects 4:15 says the way of the master consists in zhong and shu. That is all. It says that is all. So that's got to be the most important bit, right? Of course we're going to spend hundreds of years writing loads of papers on it and arguing about it. But what if Analects 4:15 isn't actually canon? Translator and philosopher Brian Van Norden thinks it was added later. And if we take that bit out, then suddenly zhong and shu aren't.
I'm hesitant here because I want to comment on the previous parody, because there's a point there, but there's also like some pushback you could make. So on the one hand, the parodying character is correct insofar as we are associating, having a heart or something like that as being, nice liberals who care about the perspectives of the autonomy of, the little people. Like, that's technically true. The problem is that you can't impute that to Chinese philosophy. That's an element of the material conditions of the time. It just was the case that the kinds of people who Confucius was criticizing had rule, and you can find equivalent cases in the context of the British Empire, who were indeed quite brutal, not in the same immediate way, more accurately, not towards their own subjects, but were quite brutal nonetheless. But like it's tricky because the parody both sticks in both directions. Like the critique has uptake for a reason, but it's also being taken way too far, and it is hypocritical. So.
Aren't the key to unlocking Confucius, they're just another part of it. God damn it! Fetch me my Lara Croft costume. We're going to have to raid some serious tombs to get to the bottom of this one. Bottom line, Confucius is difficult. And there are literally millennia worth of commentary on it, to the point where I could make 10 videos on the guy and still not cover it all. So with that in mind, I want to focus down on one aspect of his work in particular. The Jordan Peterson
So actually, before getting there, can I stop it here?
Yeah.
So she's going to try to make an analogy with Confucius and Jordan Peterson, and this is really not a good one. Okay, it is really not a good one because there are certain elements that, in a sense, echo. Okay, because Confucius did indeed speak to a lot of young men of his time who were trying to be noble people, noble men. And in a sense, Jordan Peterson does a little bit of the same thing, speaking to young, disenfranchised men that are trying to be noble in some way. Okay, but we nevertheless have to be really careful here, because she's going to try not only to echo Confucius with, to make this resemblance of Jordan Peterson and Confucius in this particular way, but she's going to try to say that Confucius' own way of thinking about morality and about the norms of conduct is analogous to Jordan Peterson's, and this is not correct. Okay, this is absolutely not correct, and this is one of the things that I'm going to be very critical with, and I'm also going to be very critical with her way of looking at what Confucius focused really on. Okay, because he didn't focus on what she thinks he focused on.
I have a suspicion that what's going on here is that as she got bigger, and this is just a suspicion, I have nothing to substantiate this whatsoever, but when I compare her earlier work to her more recent work, which is the writing gets so much better and in sections much more coherent and incisive, I have a suspicion that these are being written by multiple people, and the different sections are not clicking for that reason, because she starts off very strong talking about how this particular text can be relevant in a specific context for modern politics and modern problems. But then she jumps into this, which is a critique of a serious misapplication of a cliche of what Confucius is doing that belies the point she made in the first section. So she's really contradicting herself here. And by the time we get to the last section, she's just going to say it didn't work, and she's going to imply that it's bunk. Which again, like, these are contrary attitudes, and I'm having trouble understanding how someone who writes as well as she does in these first sections makes that jump. And my suspicion is that these are multiple scripts being written by multiple people with different specialities. That's just a guess. I have no idea if that's true.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know. Well, my opinion is that she probably wrote it all herself, but maybe she was thinking different things as she was writing it. So she had different ideas and, in a sense, gave different perspectives and different approaches. But everything that we have seen so far has been, some things might be, a little bit, we could be a little bit critical with, but everything that she has said so far has been, at a good level of analysis.
Yeah.
But what we're going to see from now on, it's going to decay. It's going to decay a lot. So this is the really important part. This is the one that's coming up now.
A concept that comes up a lot in Confucius is li, which is usually translated as rituals. Like I said at the top, ancient China had a lot of rules. Rules about when you're supposed to bow, what sorts of clothes you're supposed to wear on what days. There was a lot of ritual sacrifice. There were rules about what music could be played and when. Some elites at the top of society liked to play a little fast and loose with the rituals, like the bloody G family. And often in the Analects, Confucius stresses the importance of following them.
The master said, "Do not look unless it is in accordance with the rituals. Do not listen unless it is in accordance with the rituals. Do not speak unless it is in accordance with the rituals. Do not move unless it is in accordance with the rituals."
Stop it there right now. Okay. So we have seen one interpretation, which is Confucius was really, 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 really into Li. And she gives this quote, okay, where he says, okay, do not look unless it is in accordance with the Li. Do not listen unless it is in accordance with the Li, which gives the impression that Confucius is an old school authoritarian of, look, these are the Li, and this is what you need to do, it regardless, okay? This is what you need to do. Doesn't really matter. Now, I'm going to be critical with this, and I'm going to be providing evidence against this interpretation, because there's something that Confucius believed in even deeper than the Li, which is Ren. And what is Ren? There are different translations, but the one translation that Tong Dong Bai likes to give, and that I also like to give, is humanity. Okay, and it's also translated in the DC Lau translation, which is the one that I'm going to be showing, as benevolence. Okay, now this is the really important part. It's humanity. It's being humane. Okay, and now we can talk about what this means. But this comes before the Li. This comes before the rituals. Confucius was not an old school authoritarian, an old school conservative of we need to do these things that were good in the past just because. We need to do them because they resemble a set of moral sentiments, and those moral sentiments are the important part. And if you want, I can start already with the quotes.
I
If you
actually
want,
have a
maybe
quick.
we can give it a.
I would like you to, and before you go into that, I actually have a quick question. So when I heard you say it's translated as humanity, my immediate thought is, oh, it has to do with sort of a concern for the well-being of this thing called humanity. But then you characterize it as benevolence. Now, are these are these sort of enmeshed together?
So let me explain. So Ren here, Ren is also so there's a word in Chinese which is Ren, which means people. Okay. Now, humanity is a better translation than benevolence because, in a sense, gives the people element, brings the people element into the picture. Because Confucius was, in a sense, he promoted a morality that was universal but unequal love. Okay. Now, what does that mean? What does universal but unequal love mean? It means that you cultivate, okay, your own moral sentiments of filial piety and so on and so forth within your inner family circle, okay, your parents and your brothers and your sisters, and then you extend it outwards to your neighbors, to your entire state, and then you extend it to the full extent of humanity, and then you extend it to inanimate objects, to animals, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this translation, in a sense, puts the focus on the people, on humanity. Okay, so what it means is that. And you know why? Because Confucius, one of the things that he said, and if you want, I can also give a quote about this. Actually, why don't we go to the quotes first? Because this is going to become more clear with the quotes. I'm not going to be giving them all right now. I'm going to be giving only a couple of them, okay? But I need to see if I can find the actual ones that I'm looking for, because I have here some written down, and I want to make sure that I'm doing the correct one. So let me see if I can find here 18.6. Where are we? 17, 18.7. Is 18.6 here? Yes, it is. Okay, so let's read this part. Okay, let's read this part. He says, the master was lost in thought for a while. Okay, so there's a story here with Sulu and so on and so forth. Okay, but let's abstract from this part beforehand, and let's read this part, which is the important one. He says, the master was lost in thought for a while and said, one cannot associate with birds and beasts. Am I not a member of this human race? Who then is there for me to associate with? While the way is to be found in the empire, I will not change places with him. Okay, now let me give a really rough interpretation of what this means. Okay, so Confucius basically here is giving us, okay, a really strong statement that human beings are social by nature. Okay, and what does this resemble? This resembles the Greek, tradition of thon politikon, right? This resembles the notion of human beings are social, are political animals. We need to associate with each other. Who am I to associate with rather than human beings? Am I going to associate with birds and beasts? Of course not. We are social beings. We need to live amongst each other. And this is the important thing about Ren, okay? That in order to be able to live with each other and to associate with each other in a healthy manner, in a moral fashion, we need something, and that something is Ren, not just Li. Again, I'm going to prove why it's not just Li, but it is Ren, it's humanity, it is benevolence. And this is one quote that I wanted to give, but let me see if I can get another quote to prove that there is something that goes beyond, that goes before Li. Okay, let me see if I can find the one. Let's see if it's 3.14. Let's see if it's 3.14. Let me see. 3. Oh, by the way, this is the DC Lao translation for anyone that. So I don't think it's here. I do not think it's here. Let me see if it's 2.3.
You know what? I've got a terrible translation in front of me. Maybe I can find it.
Can you find 3.14?
3.14. 1, 2.
Because I have
3, 4, 5, 6. 7. When Duke Ting. Is that the one?
Read it. Let's see if it's that
when
one.
Duke Ting asked how a prince should employ his ministers and how ministers should serve their prince, Confucius replied saying, a prince should employ his ministers with courtesy, a minister should serve his prince with loyalty. No?
No, that's not the one. Let me see if, because I have here a list of quotes. So if it's not 3.14, let me see.
Oh, wait, hang
if
on.
it's 3.3.
Oh, no.
Okay, it's this one. It's 3.3. Okay, so it's 3.3. So let's read this one because this really gives you a refutation of what she's saying there, and she's substantiating her opinion with a quote from Confucius, but she's not giving the full picture. And this is what I say that this is what we should be critical with. Okay, so the master said, "What can a man do with the rights, with the li, who is not benevolent? What can a man do with music who is not benevolent?" Okay, and this is the DC Lao translation for Ren, for Zhen. Okay, now this is okay. What Confucius is saying here is the rights, the li. We cannot do anything if we don't have benevolence. We could, be good utilitarians and do the good things, but if we are not doing it for the right reasons, if we are not being benevolent in doing so, what can we really do with the rights? What do they serve for? This questioning, this is the really important thing here. So there is something that is more important than the li, and this is why Confucius was not an old school conservative. And this is why I consider myself in many ways a Confucian. Okay, because Confucius is interpreted as being a conservative, but in reality he's more progressive than you might think.
Well,
And
if you wanted to compare him with the conservative, I mean, conservatives are defined by their context. Confucius is addressing rulers. He's addressing rulers in a situation in which there is no mass literate society, and there is no liberal/revolutionary uprising asserting the rights of the common people. The only people who have any actual political power or influence are the elites. And in the case of the conservatives, you are dealing with people who are directly criticizing an upward movement by the lower classes. These are radically different things. And what Jordan Peterson does is he addresses a literate lower class of young men and tells them, no, don't assert your rights or of any sort of highfalutin political ends. Buckle down, take care of yourselves. And he doesn't address this to the people who are actually in power. So he's kind of the inverse of Confucius in a way. I don't think it's appropriate to compare them at all.
Ways.
It's an opposite, yeah.
Absolutely.
But
this
if
is the important
only...
thing. Okay,
yeah.
This is the important thing, that yes, Confucius was concerned with the li, but no, the li was not the most important thing. And actually, if you want, I can show you an even better quote on this. Okay, okay. This is going to be the last quote before we proceed. Okay, and maybe I'm running out of quotes after this one, but I do think I have more. Let's see if I can then find the context for those. Let's see, maybe it's 17.21. I think it's 17.21. See if I find it. No. 17.21. Here it is. Okay, so let's read this because this is a really good one. Okay, so let's give you some context before we read this. So there's a really good, really solid. Okay, not that I think it's good, but a really solid right that belonged to the li at the time, which was the 3-year mourning. Okay, my pronunciation here it gets really sloppy, but bear with me. The 3-year mourning period, which is a period where when a parent of yours dies, you need to, in a sense, abstain from drinking, eating good food, drinking good drinks, whatever they are, eating good food, okay, which at the time was rice. Okay, so you need to abstain from eating rice, wearing fine clothes, and dancing and doing really good things. Okay, Now, this is a norm, okay, within the Li. Now, let's read here what Confucius is going to say and what a person, okay, Tsai Wo, that we can read here, okay, this name, Tsai Wo, is a follower of Confucius, okay, he's a disciple of Confucius, who is, in a sense, being a little bit critical with the 3-year mourning, okay? So he's being confronted, Confucius, okay, as a person that called himself, trying to preserve these traditions, is being confronted with a person who is saying, maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe this is too extreme. Maybe 3 years is too much, okay? Now let's see what his response is, because this is not the response of an old school authoritarian, okay? Then this is going to be the important thing here. Let's see. So Tsai Wo asked about the 3-year mourning period, saying, even a full year is too long. If the gentleman gives up the practice of the rites for 3 years, the rites are sure to be in ruins. If he gives up the practice of music for 3 years, music is sure to collapse. A full year's mourning is quite enough. After all, in the course of a year, the old grain having been used up and the new grain ripens, and fire is renewed by fresh drilling. The master said, would you then be able to enjoy eating your rice and wearing your finery? Yes, I would, Tsai Wo replied. If you're able to enjoy them, do so by all means. The gentleman in mourning finds no relish in good food, no pleasure in music, and no comforts in his own home. That is why he does not eat his rice and wear his finery. Since it appears that you enjoy them, then do so by all means. After Tsai Wo had left, the master said, how unfeeling you is. Okay, so this is he's referring here to Tsai Wo, okay? And unfeeling here, this a better translation maybe is inhumane. How inhumane you is. A child ceases to be nursed by his parents only when he's 3 years old. The 3 years mourning is observed throughout the empire. Now, this is also not a very good translation, because in that time they thought that the empire was literally the whole of the earth. So a better translation here is the earth. Okay, it's the full earth, because that's what they thought that the empire was, the actual, the extent of what the earth was. Was you not given 3 years love by their parents? Now, what did we read here? Okay, let's meditate about this for a second. So we have a part of the Li, which is the 3-year mourning, and we have a person who is critiquing, okay, the 3 years, and presenting a good argument, in fact, because he's, in a sense, defending the Li by critiquing the Li. So he's trying to say, look, if we do this for so long, the Li is going to be ruined. So he's giving actually a good argument. But look at what Confucius says. He says he doesn't even care about whether or not his argument is correct. He just says, would you be able to enjoy your rice and wearing your finery? Would you be, from your heart, would you actually enjoy doing these things when your parents die? And Tsai Wo said, of course I would. And then he said, okay, then do so, do it. And then when Tsai Wo left, okay, so this is a sneaky way of approaching this topic. Confucius said, look at this person. Isn't he inhumane? Look at how inhumane this person is. Why? Because his parents gave him 3 years of mourning, okay, so 3 years of not being able to do anything that they actually enjoyed, because they loved him for the first 3 years of his life when he wasn't able to do anything for himself. Actually, we could argue that it's more than 3 years that his parents, that Tsai Wo's parents, had to, struggle in order to raise Tsai Wo. And yet, Confucius is giving an even better argument, which is, look, why we need to do the 3-year mourning is because from the love of our hearts, when a person of our a close person like our parents dies, we just don't feel like doing those things. Okay, it doesn't come from my heart to do those things because I don't enjoy them anymore. And maybe you can relate to this. Okay, I can certainly relate to this. One of my grandparents died in January, and I really loved him. He was like a parent to me, and we did certain things together that were like that I really enjoyed doing with him. And at some point after he died, I tried to do those things and I realized that I couldn't. Now, it's not because I was following, the 3-year mourning, I cannot do these things, because I saw it as something that came, that was given to me, like, you need to do, you cannot do this. It's because it didn't come from my heart to do that. I couldn't eat those things that I used to eat with him. I couldn't do those activities that I really enjoy doing, but that I used to do with him because he's no longer there. So that is where the important part here comes. It is not the Li, it is the Ren, it is the benevolence, it is humanity. And this is why Tsai Wo was then, cancelled as being an inhumane person, because he didn't feel the need to abstain from those things when his parents died.
It's sort of it reminds me of in a negative version in a way of like the story of the rich young man from what is it, from Matthew 10, where it's like this young wealthy guy approaches Christ and is like, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus replies, the commandments: do not murder, do not commit adultery, don't steal, don't bear false witness, don't cheat others, honor your father and your mother, etc. And then he says, all these I have kept from my youth. And then Jesus replies, there's one thing you lack, go sell everything you own and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, then come follow me. But the man was saddened by these words and went away in sorrow because he had great wealth. Or if you want to take it to a more like a Greek context, like the idea that good laws follow down from a virtuous character of the citizenry. It's actually very anti-authoritarian. It's almost Hegelian or compatible with Hegel in a way in which the peak of freedom isn't when you have no laws. It's when your character is such that in being free, you abide by the laws, now, assuming good laws, of course.
So this is the really important part here, okay? Is what is important about the rights is that they represent the deep moral feelings, and those are the ones that we want to preserve. That's what Confucius is saying here. And you know what? Another thing that is important to highlight here is, why didn't Confucius confront Tsai Wo? Why didn't he try to convince Tsai Wo? Because Confucius believed that at some point, if somebody is not willing to listen, you should just give up. It's pointless at some points to argue with somebody who doesn't feel like being convinced about something.
Yeah, and he had a reputation, or at least he has a reputation in lore, I guess, of being someone who really changed his countenance very radically depending on who he was talking to. Like if he was in the context of a court, you would not be able to distinguish him from a courtly minister. They depict him as stooping when he enters into the palace, things like that. When he's dealing with people on the street, with common folk, like he addresses them like that. And I think it's there's even a quote in here somewhere that I can't remember where it is exactly, but it talks about how the sage, or what have you, this translation renders it as the true philosopher, but the sage doesn't care if he's recognized as such. And again, like we're reading Hegel in the Discord, so I'm thinking very much of that. But like that, where the most authentically philosophically minded person is someone who is really like, they're engaging with the world as a self-understood sort of, as like Fanon described, as like an arid space where it's they what is the language exactly? They sublate things in the world and then purge it all, and all that's left is just it's simultaneously both something useless and empty, and also like, I'm not going to get into that because I'm going to butcher it and it's just going to confuse things. But,
so hopefully this quote, illustrated what I wanted to express there, which is Confucius was not an old school authoritarian conservative, okay?
Yeah.
He redefined what it meant, for example, to be a gentleman, okay, in such a way that didn't just appeal to the hierarchy of power, but that appealed to the hierarchy of benevolence, okay? Of a gentleman is somebody that is benevolent, okay? Somebody who actually has these moral feelings, and those are the ones that then move him, push him to act upon the Li, to do the Li, okay? But it's not just the Li. So we can move to the video now to continue.
Yeah.
And when I first read that, I found it quite tough to imagine myself into that headspace, because I don't really think of our society as having a lot of rituals like that. And then I realized that we kind of do. We've got little ones like covering your mouth when you yawn or saying excuse me when you burp. Li doesn't just mean like religious services, there's a dimension to it that's like etiquette and propriety as well. It's a motorbike. And then I realized that we sure do have some big rituals here at Parliament.
The British Parliament is an ingenious work of British geniusness, made up of two houses, both alike in dignity. The House of Commons and the House of Lords. The British, by their nature, loathe tyranny and embrace freedom, which is why the House of Lords is completely unelected. Whenever a new parliament begins, Her Majesty the Queen, God bless her, gives a speech from the House of Lords, which has itself been written by the members of the House of Commons. The senior officer of the House of Lords, who is referred to by the title Black Rod, is sent from the Lords to the Commons to invite the members to hear what Her Majesty has to say, even though they already know what she has to say because they wrote it. And when Black Rod arrives at the Commons, they slam the door in his face. And then they open the door again, and they all go and hear the speech anyway. This eminently sensible and really quite simple procedure is designed to illustrate that the Commons is independent from the monarchy. But not so independent that they'll get rid of her. It may appear to be an enormous waste of money and time.
Okay, so here's an equivocation between, I guess, Li and sort of empty pageantry. Like, this has been denuded of all significance. It really is just a thing that is done. And that's sort of, again, emblemized by the fact that this person, one of the only people who's paying attention to it in popular media, being this person we're dealing with here, regards it as sort of a hollow joke. So I don't think pageantry is what Confucius had in mind. In fact, I think it is precisely the hollow nature of this display that would make him emphasize, like, this needs to come from a virtuous character.
Yeah, so the important thing is that the Li, in a sense, which were, the set of rules that normally came from the Zhou dynasty, okay, because Confucius says along the in the Analects, there is a quote from him where he says, "I am for the Zhou," okay, where he basically says that he is indeed, a supporter of the Zhou dynasty and of the Zhou rights. That is what he means by Li, by the way, the Zhou Li. And the important thing here is that the Zhou Li, he believed, best represents our deeper moral sentiments. It's not just, a set of, very weird things that are done here and there just because. They are things that actually emanate from our deeper moral feelings. Like, for example, the 3-year mourning. This is not the same as the parliament thing, okay? The 3-year mourning is not the same thing.
Yeah, he selects them. He selects them for their significance and for practical reasons, not just because they're old.
Exactly, and not just because they are very simple, very, like the parliament thing there, They are actually like things that are supposed to reflect deeper moral sentiments, not just some very vague, abstract notions of political, of the division of powers or anything of the sort, They are supposed to represent humanity, not some bizarre political concepts here and there.
State opening of Parliament is a ritual that doesn't really affect the system all that much. It's more of a symbol. But there are some parliamentary rituals that really do make a massive difference to what happens in there and, therefore, out here. For instance, if you're an MP, you have to use what they call parliamentary language. And that can be pretty strict. You cannot call people liars or hypocrites or corrupt. In 2016, an MP named Dennis Skinner called then Prime Minister David Cameron Dodgy Dave, and he was suspended for it. In 2019, Ian Blackford called Boris Johnson a racist, and it was only barely allowed. And even then, he had to warn Boris beforehand. And to my mind, there's two ways of looking at this. The first is to say, well, what if an MP is dodgy or is racist? Don't we need to be able to say it? If MPs are bound by all these rituals, then doesn't that mean that there are certain realities the government cannot face, certain perspectives the House just cannot accommodate, no matter how much the people might want them to be? Doesn't that guarantee that the government will always be a little bit out of touch or inflexible or even undemocratic? You could even take it one step further and say all these rituals just protect the status quo and perpetuate the current unjust way of doing things. Isn't it a bit of a bad joke that members abide by all these civilized rules inside, whilst outside, people are really dying as a result of their decisions?
Yeah, but I mean, this is again taking.
It is a good critique of the kind of rights that she's critiquing, that she's trying to be critical of right there. But this doesn't mean that we cannot have good rights, and those are the ones that Confucius was trying to get at, the good rights.
I think also
that represented humanity.
I think also
and not all of them are good. Like, not all of them are good. Okay, I'm not for the Joe in that sense.
Yeah, I think also, I think trying to make a one-to-one connection between pageantry in British Parliament, say, or like, civility regulations on the floor, whatever they call it in Crumpet Land, with China, because one of the characteristics of Chinese politics is, or Chinese government rather, is that actually what happens in the court very often doesn't have an upshot for the common people for a very long time. China was a very vast place. There's a saying that I was told by a Chinese politics professor a little while back. The emperor is far away and the mountains are very high. The capacity of Chinese government to actually directly impact the people itself. It's not even just a matter of the people themselves being sort of in some sense structurally immune to what happens in Chinese courts.
But that was in the past, because today, decisions are made and they are enforced quite efficiently today in China.
Well, because we're connected with each other like this. But in the context of China, it's almost like observing government decisions are like the impact of a supernova. You only get the effect of it long after it's taken place. And so in that, like, this is why the metaphor of the relationship between the elites and the common folk is of a wind and blades of grass. It's like a slow force that sort of changes the direction of things, sort of like a wave. Like, I think the immediacy here, like the relationship between politics and time, is really important to take into account here, because it is radically distinct. Like the question of whether or not this impedes certain thoughts from being spoken of in court, I mean, I suppose in a sense, but it's not as if this was like a liberal context in which there was a rigorous exchange of ideas in court. These were people who had to hold on to power very materially. Like, these weren't parliaments. These were rulers who ruled by the sword and their advisors. And there were no norms protecting people if they displeased the ruler. So this is all sort of beside the point, because for this critique to matter in the context of Confucius, you need to have sort of a political paradigm that just has no roots there. And it's immaterial to whether or not Chinese culture had a heart. It just has to do with the fact that there's a concrete element to liberal politics that just hadn't happened here, because it's an English invention, for better or worse.
Let's proceed.
Aren't the rituals just a hypocritical gloss over what is, in reality, quite a bloody business? The flower that hides the serpent under it. Doesn't it piss you off that they play nice with each other, that some of them are so rich and powerful, they can just flout the rules that the rest of us have to live by? I mean, who do they think they are? The bloody G family? And if that's you, then yeah, I'm not going to say that you're wrong, mate. But Confucius, at least, didn't think that was actually going to solve the problem. So he tried a different approach.
Confucius was a ru, which was a job, kind of like a civil servant. If you were a ru, you would travel around the various states doing government odd jobs, like maybe you become an advisor to the local duke. Maybe you get put in charge of a big ceremony. Maybe you control when the crops get planted now. To be a ru, you had to know all the rules of how everything's supposed to work. Not just the practical government rules, but also all of the li, the rituals. The ru were experts in the details of the conventions of funerals, of daily contexts such as eating and gift exchange, and of other significant ritual locations. Proper ritual performance was seen as both a means to cultivate moral character and as a legitimator of political authority. For these reasons, ru were sought out to serve in official capacities for the landed gentry of the central states of early China. Apparently, ru also translates as moist. Skincare is important. The Cambridge Chinese to English Dictionary defines ru as
Skincare is
seriously,
important, by the
who
way. That's something that I agree with right there.
It's not that important, man.
Quotes the dictionary in their video essays. Amateur move, lol, send Bitcoin. Confucius was apparently really good at being a ru. He knew all the rituals, where everyone's supposed to stand, when the music is supposed to be played. He knew how things were done in the good old days, under the sage kings, when the Zhou dynasty was really something. And he was highly sought as a teacher for young men who wanted to be ru. Because of his emphasis on ritual and tradition, Confucius has a reputation for being a rigid conformist. The Chinese never had a secular enlightenment, which is why they're bound by obsolete traditions and an obsession with the past. Unlike Great Britain, where if you say anything bad about Churchill, I'll f***ing have you. But Confucius wasn't totally inflexible. He says it's fine to deviate and change things if it's in keeping with the spirit of the ritual. And that's the kicker. He's very critical of those who go
She's
through
not going
all
to
the
explain
right
what the spirit
procedures,
is.
but they don't have the right spirit. Like the bloody G family.
She's not going to explain what the spirit is. What is that spirit, and what are the elements of that spirit? Okay, so she's in a sense trying to get there, or saying, yes, okay, so it's not just about the li, but she's not getting fully there. So she's giving more the impression that Confucius is more interested with the li than with ren, which is the benevolence.
Yeah. I think this is really where she starts to again like lose the thread. Like she's changing the thesis from Confucius has relevance to Confucius is backward. Like it's ironic because the parody she just made is now going to start to apply in a little way to her, which is odd.
You don't use the rituals to make yourself feel big and important, Mr. G. It's about having respect. He wanted people
It's not
to
about having
follow the
respect.
rituals.
It's not just about the respect. It's about being humane. Okay, but let her continue. Let her continue.
Yeah.
So they would learn good character, and that's not just good for you. It's good for everybody. Like the rituals at Parliament. Yeah, okay, maybe sometimes strong language is called for.
I think she
and it's a
salvaged that a
drawback
little
that
bit.
MPs can't use it.
Yeah.
But the purpose of that ritual is supposed to be that you respect the person you're speaking to. If not the person themselves, then at least the office they hold. Whatever personal grievances you have, whatever the issue of the day is, whether your side is winning or losing, there is supposed to be something more important, which is the role of the house itself and ultimately democracy. You gotta respect that higher order because it is, in a word, sacred. Confucius is kind of on some Jordan Peterson in a way. He's like, you gotta respect all these values and these norms that are encoded in the rituals and the stories of our ancient forefathers. It's all part of a society, and it's the values that undergird everything, and you gotta respect that. You gotta master all these traditions. You gotta stand up and take
this. If he was like that, when we were reading Tsai Wo's criticism of Confucius, this would have been Confucius' reaction to Tsai Wo. But what was Confucius' reaction? It wasn't, you gotta respect the Li and the, it wasn't that. It wasn't that. Confucius' reaction was, would you then be able to enjoy eating your rice and wearing your finery? Yes, I would. If you're able to enjoy them, then do so by all means. Okay, this was Confucius' reaction.
Yeah.
So it's not what she's saying there.
And again, like, who he's addressing matters. Like he's addressing rulers. Like when Jordan Peterson addresses young men, he tells them to keep your sights sort of down to earth. Don't be too ambitious. Don't rock the boat too much. Stuff like that. What Confucius is doing is he's like when Confucius left government, the ruler of I think the region was Lu. The ruler of Lu had been sent a bunch of courtesans and dancers and whatnot to undermine him, and he ended up neglecting affairs of state because he was just hanging out with all of these women all the time. And there were no immediate consequences for the ruler because, of course, he's immune to the consequences. He has power and wealth. He has all of the things that would that the loss of which would motivate someone to listen to Jordan Peterson, because that's this whole thing. It's like don't allow chaos to get into your life because stuff will break down. You'll lose control, things like that. If you have a certain level of material padding, that's not the case, or at least not for a little while. Confucius is addressing that person. He's not addressing like the low income farmer or what have you.
But you need you know what I mean. We need to think about here for a second. What is Jordan Peterson's message? Okay, let's think a bit, because it's not even a very cohesive message that Jordan Peterson has. It is contradictory at times because he's trying ultimately, okay, whether consciously or not, to defend a given set of social conditions, a given set of power structures today, okay? And that is why normally Jordan Peterson has certain contradictions, like one that I identified in the past, where he would say, you need to be, very careful with yourself. You need to care only about yourself. If somebody, does something wrong, think about how you could do better. Think about how you could do things better. Don't focus on other people. Focus only on yourself. And then at the same time, he's going all out on the social justice warriors, saying that these are, ill-minded people that are trying to destroy the West, and that we should all collectively join to battle them, and we should try to do the best to stop their rhetoric instead of just focusing on ourselves and trying to see what we could do better so that these people don't appear in the world. Okay, now this is a contradiction, and this contradiction comes because in the end, his only message is you should only focus on yourself when it comes to engaging in purposeful activities against the status quo. That is his true message, whether he's conscious about it or not. And that's why he has that contradiction in his way of thinking. But this is not Confucius. This is absolutely not Confucius. Confucius is not concerned with making cleaning your room, okay? Confucius is concerned with being able to, in a sense, unite people together through a set of moral sentiments that are materially expressed in the Li, and that ultimately bond people together through, moral sentiments of love for your parents, love for your neighbors, love for other people, okay, of being humane to them, of wanting to work with them, okay, on wanting to build with them a good and strong society. But it is not the same as, focus on yourself, what you could be doing better. It doesn't matter what other people do, just clean your room, all of that. Okay, these are different messages.
Well, there's revolutionary import here. He's talking about an ideological, in a sense, an ideological restructuring of how people rule. This is it's assiduously not a conservative message. This is new. It invokes old things, but this is a new way of thinking about how one should govern.
Well, I mean, what I think is that Confucius, okay, talked about the old and he redefined the old in order to be able to focus on today, on the problems of today, of his today. Okay, but Jordan Peterson is in a sense creating his own system of what you should do based on certain, on a set of principles from here and from there. Okay, some of which are religious, some of which are from wherever, and he's trying to put it all together into a system that ultimately is concerned with purely individualistic means and with defending the status quo. But it is not like Confucius, who believed in humanity and believed in, again, that humans can only live in societies with other humans. They cannot be among birds and beasts. They cannot be for themselves, not among birds and beasts. They need to be with other humans.
I think we're experiencing some latency here. Let's give you a couple seconds to catch up. There we go. Okay, now I think your video was behind your audio for a brief second.
Okay.
We heard you. It's okay.
Okay. Perfect. Let's continue. See where she takes the analogy.
Back, and it's such a shame that we're losing these values that undergird society, and the Zhou dynasty's falling apart. It's up to you. You got to stand up and defend the East against all the that's going on. Unlike Jordan Peterson, though, the sacred higher order Confucius is gesturing towards isn't necessarily a religious one. The Analects uses this character, Tian, a lot, which is usually translated as heaven, and that has made some Western commentators very excited, because they're like, oh wow, Confucius believes in heaven. That means that we can convert the Chinese to Christianity. The Chinese never had a secular enlightenment, which is why we have to teach them about the greatest Englishman of all time, Jesus. But
can you stop there for a second, just for like a second? So Confucianism is not a religion. That's why it is compatible with almost all religions in the world. Okay, that's why there can be Christian Confucians, there can be Muslim Confucians, there can be many other religions. Okay, can be Confucians themselves, and there are indeed strands of Confucians who are Catholic or who are Muslim, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's because Confucianism is a really universal philosophy. Okay, it is not a chauvinist philosophy in that sense of Jordan Peterson's, of the West and the values of Christianity and so on and so forth. It's very, very different. And she's right on this particular point, that Confucius didn't really have a religious set of values, unlike Jordan Peterson. But then I think nevertheless, she's trying to make that analogy, and that I think is wrong. Okay, because there might be certain echoes, there are no analogous points here.
Yeah, I'm going to push back on that a little bit, and I'm going to go back to what I was saying about some of the problems associated with trying to group different cultural traditions under the umbrella of a category derived from a specific cultural tradition. So one of the problems we have when we try to categorize things from different cultures as religions is that the concept of religion is not simply a universal category that simply applies to all places. When you look, for example, at the early formulations of the concept of world religions, when anthropologists and philologists and what have you were looking at different cultures, different communities within the British Empire, and trying to determine, well, not just in the British Empire, but trying to determine, okay, what are these societies made up of? Their points of reference were institutions that had developed in the context of Europe and England. And so what they did was they looked for, if you look at someone like Durkheim, his definition of what a religion was a church. And so when a lot of these early thinkers of religious studies were looking at different cultures, they would look for, okay, where is the church? And there were some confusing things, like they would see, well, it's a little bit strange. In India, we see Muslims and Hindus, whatever that means, going to the same temples, because there wasn't a fine distinction between the church space and the place of government and things like that. And when you go back in time and you look at the actual history of the concept of religion, there's a fairly traceable genealogy, and there's two books that you can look at to get this. There's Brent Nongbree's Before Religion, and there is Daniel and Boyarin, I think. They have got a book called Imagine No Religion, which of course is taking the title from the is it a Beatles song? I don't know. But what they show is that in its earliest usage, the Latin root religio referred to It was something very in particular. It referred to a sense of gravity. Things had a religio about them when they had a certain weight about them. If you entered into a court, there was a religio about it. If you felt afraid at disobeying your parents, there was a religio. If you made an agreement with like a solemn oath, there was religio about it. Now, you could have too much religio. You could, for example, be so afraid of disobeying your parents that you're very unexplorative and you don't do a whole lot. Or you could be, for example, maybe what we would call superstitious. You could be approaching, like there was a case in Livy where a barbarian army was approaching Rome. The Roman army had fled, and they thought, wow, they ran too early. This must be a trap. And because of their excess of religio, of essentially a kind of fear, they didn't take the advantage and they ended up losing the city. Now, you can move forward to people like Cicero, and during the social strife in Rome during his lifetime, you had a whole host of different sort of cultic and what we might, like the equivalent today would be things like New Age cults and whatnot. And so there was a distinction between proper religio and superstitio, where religio is now no longer construed as being a scalar order of fear or gravity, and now became an appropriate set of practices that was associated with a certain level of fear or gravity. And superstitio was simply inappropriate. And you move on from there, the Christianization of Rome, that now starts to be particularized to different sort of monk orders. So again, like it's associated now with practice, not with the human capacity, either in excess or in deficiency. And you move on from there to eventually getting the idea of institutions as religions, and you move on to like these abstractions from there, world religions, which are basically just finding Christianity in its purely formal sense in other cultures where Christianity never was. In the earliest sense, you can absolutely say that Confucius was thoroughly religious. In the later sense, not at all, because this was a material circumstance. This was a particular moment in history where this thing called religion became a fixture in global political life. It's a radically different meanings, and we aren't particular enough about that when we talk about what is a religion and what isn't. So I mean, you would absolutely never call Confucianism a religion, but you would absolutely call someone who abides by it religious, maybe in this earlier sense. But let's keep going.
Context, it seems like he's using Tian more to mean fate or destiny or the universe, not so much a personal god. The Cambridge Chinese to English Dictionary defines Tian as, "I'm sorry I stole your dictionary. I'm going through some stuff right now, but it wasn't okay to take it out on you. I did lose the book down a storm drain, but now that I've actually watched your videos, I decided to subscribe, hit the bell, and sign up to your Patreon." Confucius is certainly less mystical than the Buddhists and the Taoists, who were also kicking around at this time. He's not saying you have to follow the rituals because God says so. He thought that if kings and dukes and officials could be inspired to follow the rituals, cultivate good character, and do their jobs with respect, it would inspire everyone else. And that's how we fix a broken society. Just desire the good yourself, and the common people will be good. The virtue of the gentleman is like wind. The virtue of the small man is like grass. Let the wind blow over the grass, and it is sure to bend.
Yeah, so this is, if
To
you can stop
govern-
it here a second. She's going to give a quote that resembles that message of the initial one. So this is a part of Confucianism that is more or less correct and that is well established, which is that Confucius believed that the sages, so the gentlemen, are in a sense the ones that inspire the lower people, the people that are not gentlemen, to behave properly, to follow the rules, to follow the rights, and to be able to, in a sense, bring society to a higher stage, okay, to a higher level, okay, to a more moral society. Now, this is correct, okay, but I don't think that this is I think that this is part of a good solution, Confucian's solution to the problems of today. But I think that what is most important is the notion of Ren, okay, of the notion of benevolence being what unites people together, of people behaving in accordance with, okay, the principles of benevolence. And we can debate on what those principles are. But, I think that it is more that it is less, just having politicians that behave like gentlemen and more and then inspire other people to behave like gentlemen, which is certainly part of what I would also like to see. But it is also more a system that teaches people those values and in a sense motivates them not just from seeing the gentlemen in politics and in other spheres of society being gentlemen, but that they are taught from the very beginning in an educational system that teaches those moral sentiments, and also in a society that encourages those moral sentiments, okay, because it's also important, and this is something that Han Feize, for example, is going to be critical with Confucius, okay. He's going to say, this is going to be later, but to give a gist of what Han Feize says in critique of, and this is a really strong critique, by the way. Han Feize says, okay, when he reads the stories about the sage rulers, you don't need to do that because
I just realized.
When you read, when he read all of those stories about the sage rulers being very kind and being very noble and ruling, like true gentlemen, he said, and the people being, also, respecting filial piety and all of that. He said, why these people were able to do this? Because they lived at a time where there was no scarcity. They lived at a time where, populations were small, where, communities were, bonded together through strong material ties. But today, societies are large. This was Han Feize, by the way. So even today, this is an even better argument. But even at Han Feize's time, this was a good argument, which is, but today people are no longer, living in small communities where there is an abundance of goods, where they can share with each other, where they can behave properly. And this is his critique to Confucianism. One of the elements of his critique is the material circumstances of today do not allow for people being benevolent. And that's why people are not benevolent anymore. It's not just that we have lost the sentiments, it's that the material circumstances in which we live, and in a sense, Han Feize is in a sense being a materialist, a Marxist almost in that respect, right? Saying, look, we no longer live with the material circumstances that allow for benevolence to be the bond that unites people together. And that's why Han Feize gave a different solution to the problem of what is to bond people together. Confucius says, Ren, it's benevolence, it's humanity, what is going to unite people. Han Feize says it needs to be a strong, powerful state and a legal system associated with that state that is enforced irrespective of who is in what position. Okay, that is Han Feize's solution. Okay, now the thing is that what I want, okay, the communist solution to this is, yes, okay, there are true elements in both sides here. So what we want is we want to bring about a society where the productive capabilities have advanced to such an extent that there is a superabundance, and we are back at the era of the sage rulers, where people can indeed be humane. So I want to preserve as a communist the values and the moral sentiments, some of those that Confucius, for example, the Confucian moral system and political system. But at the same time, I'm also, aware of Han Feize's criticism, and I say, yes, we need to advance the productive capabilities so that this could actually be done.
And that's the fading away of the state.
Yes. Yes. And that is what I think the communist solution is. And that is why I am a Confucian, but like I also have my more legalist elements. I can be a legalist in many ways as well.
Yeah, because Confucius speaks to a specific time and place. And it may be a time and place that we want to revive in certain respects, or at least the good parts of, but it doesn't provide solutions for a world in which material conditions have shifted radically from that.
Yes.
Yeah. I think that's perhaps one of the major flaws of this video, is that she's attempting to apply Confucius directly to our condition, when our condition is, it's like trying to apply chess strategy to checkers or something.
is to correct. If you set an example by being correct, who would dare to remain incorrect? Also, unlike Jordan Peterson, Confucius didn't think that following the rituals and cultivating good character would necessarily benefit you. A lot of the advice he gives seems to me to be aimed at young men, and they were men, starting out in their careers as Ru. There's stuff in here about
one thing here
not
that
comparing
is
yourself
important
to
to note is that Confucius was really backward in the sense of talking about women. Okay, Confucius didn't have very good things to say about women, and that is something that many Confucians have been critical with throughout the centuries. Okay, and that is part of the reason why many Confucians have then been the ones that advocated for universal education applied to women too. One of those was, for example, Lim Bun Kang, okay, who was a straight-born Chinese and a really, really famous Confucian thinker, and also a medical doctor, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that he did, for example, was promote the education of women, of young girls as well, you know. And this is important because Confucius, obviously, this is not a problem of Confucius' system. This is a problem of his own personal views. Okay, you see what I mean? It's like there's nothing in Confucianism that avoids making the claim women should also be allowed to be gentlemen. In this sense, women should also be allowed to be educated and to have all of those virtuous qualities. There's nothing in Confucianism saying that, but Confucius, because he had personal tastes like everyone else, ended up believing that. But there is no contradiction here in the sense of within the system. And that's why many Confucians afterward have been the ones to promote women's education and so on and so forth.
Do you have a rough sense of when those critiques started to be fielded? Like, was this something that he was critiqued for in his own time, or like shortly after his life? Or
I mean, I'm not really familiar with the specifics on that, but I would say that at the time, you know, the way in which his society worked was a really patriarchal society in that regard. And although women, you know, were still, you know, there were certain elements of that society that, you know, venerated women in certain ways, it was nevertheless, you know, still a society where women weren't able to be educated and so on and so forth, where they weren't able to have, and for a long part in Chinese history, by the way. That's one of the things that people that are more Maoist say that was good about Maoist China, which is that they elevated the status of women to an extent that wasn't that hadn't been done before, because China had been very traditional with regards to the male-female roles, you know, until Mao came. And that now I think that is a story that I think it's too idealized. Okay.
yeah,
But I nevertheless do think that there were certain improvements with regards to the status of women in Mao's China. Not that
which
I think
again
that it was
is like
correct,
is not necessarily a practical endorsement of the material outcomes of Mao's rule per se, at least not universally. Just for
Yes.
clarification, yeah.
Yes.
It's just that was a part of the essence of the communist critique.
Yeah, that was really rooted in Chinese culture. You know, that those traditional female and male roles were really rooted in Chinese culture, and they had been enforced for many years and for many dynasties. Okay, for the centuries almost. And that's why, you know, the critiques came, okay, to Confucius for being, you know, really misogynist in certain ways. But you know, those critiques, I'm not sure whether they started to come immediately at his time, whether it took longer, but I do know that at some point he was critiqued for that, and there were indeed, you know, Confucians that were the ones in charge of creating, for example, schools for women based on Confucian principles, because there's no contradiction in Confucianism in the sense of supporting women's rights and the ability for women to be educated and so on and so forth. This was just a personal taste of Confucius because he lived at a time where this was the, you know, what was going on.
I wonder if there were penalties for that as well, like if there were material enforcements, you know, to I don't know if that's the case.
They were. I mean, China, ancient China was really, really like many other societies at the time. They were really strict in their penalties for violating norms of conduct. One of those was, for example, the 3-year mourning. Okay, if you violated the 3-year mourning, this was penalized with death.
Well, that was
It was
pretty much.
really, really.
Yeah.
It was really serious.
Now, crucially, like again, like this isn't dissing China. I was going to say Chinese culture, and I switched it. This isn't denigrating Chinese culture in particular. This is the case in almost every society pre-Christianization, pre the liberal revolution. In Rome, right up to the time of its Christianization, women in the household could be killed at will by their husbands or their fathers or whoever had ownership of them at the time. This is the case for Greece. This is the case basically everywhere.
Others and taking on responsibility. The sort of thing that you'd want to hear if you were just beginning a new job and you weren't really sure of yourself. And he also says, hey, I know that you'll worry about whether you're advancing in your career or falling behind, but you got to understand it's not about you. Heaven has given you a gift. It's this thing and this thing. And those are not for you. They're not
But heaven
you
didn't
can-
give you those like. So this is important because humanity is cultivated. Okay, humanity, benevolence, those moral sentiments are cultivated, and that is something that Confucius is very, strong about. You need to cultivate your moral sentiments. You need to cultivate your humanity. And how do you cultivate it? And here, Mencius, for example, Mencius gives certain answers here where you start from your family and then you move outwards. But you need to cultivate it. It's not something that is given to you magically. This is something that you need to cultivate.
Yeah, there's a Christian glazing sort of creeping into this. She is kind of it's a little bit strange because she took pains to point out that this isn't a religion, and yet at the same time, she's the one applying this,
giving more
religious
religious elements there. Yeah.
Profit. They're for everybody. If you really want to hone your gift and maximize your potential, you got to use it to serve other people. The whole idea of individual benefit as opposed to the common good doesn't really fit with Confucius' whole system. That's why his ethics and his politics.
Yes, he doesn't have a distinction between the community and the individual.
Exactly. Yeah, he doesn't even negatively reference it, and I think that's what's a bit confusing about this presentation.
Yeah, this is a really good point on her side, by the way. He doesn't really have this distinction. So this dichotomy between the community and the individual within the context of Confucianism is not really that well understood. Okay, so it's not really an issue because he understood human beings as ton politikon. Okay, so that's why he didn't make this distinction.
When he talks about the glue that holds society together, it's not laws and individual rights, the way we might think of it now. It's playing well with others. And the way you practice that is with the rituals. So Confucius wanted to remind everybody why these traditions mattered. And crucially, if he could remind the guys in government why they mattered, maybe things would get better. And that's pretty understandable, right? Faced with a society that was slowly falling apart, with elites who openly broke the rules for their own profit and got away with it, you can see why he was like, well, we got to remind everybody why all this stuff is important. Too bad it didn't work.
Well, not that it didn't work. Not that it didn't work. It was certainly not very popular in certain parts of Chinese history. And now we're going to look at the legalist, a little bit more at the legalist school, particularly at Han Feizi. And now we're going to see some more nuance into this question, but it's not that it didn't work, okay? Because Confucius certainly had a lot of impact on political decision making for many years after his death, and even within his life. So,
yeah, and this smacks a little bit of people talking about communism not working, right? Like it's a set of ideas that weren't actually deployed in a way that is purely representative of every single attempt to deploy them or even of their deploying whatsoever.
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah.
More or less. So let's see this because this is a good part.
Fast forward a couple of hundred years to another philosopher called Sun Tzu. He was.
So
a
this is
Confucian.
about
He picked up all
pronunciation
that
as well.
stuff about-
This is Shunzi. Shunzi. Okay, maybe I'm not pronouncing it in the best way, but it's certainly better than the pronunciation that she's giving right there. And this was a Confucian philosopher, but he had more legalist elements. Although he had more legalist elements, although the legalist school was not developed at his time. Not even the actual what today we consider the legalist philosophers. Not even they. It is debated whether or not they saw themselves as being within this system, okay, of thinking. But yes, Shunzi was a Confucian, and he was, a teacher of Han Feizi, but he had certain elements that inspired Han Feizi to move towards what we now know as the legalist school.
about following the rituals and cultivating virtue, but he was even less spiritual. He actually says, yeah, forget about the spirits and astrology and comets and omens. Let's think about crops, yeah? Let's think about food, real stuff. Follow the rituals, yeah, absolutely, but just don't have your head in the clouds about it. The point is to change yourself, to correct yourself. And here we start seeing a bit of a shift in how the concept of Li, rituals, is used. When Confucius talks about Li, he emphasizes self-control and cultivating the virtues and setting a good example. When Junzi talks about Li, he's talking about it being enforced. Crooked wood must be heated and bent before it becomes straight. Blunt metal must be ground and whetted before it becomes sharp. The nature of man is evil. It must depend on teachers and laws to become correct and achieve Li, and then it becomes disciplined. Without teachers and laws, he is unbalanced, off the track, and incorrect. Without Li, there will be rebellion, disorder, and chaos. The sage kings of antiquity, knowing that the nature of man is evil and that it is unbalanced, off the track, incorrect, rebellious, disorderly, and undisciplined, created Li and instituted laws and systems in order to correct man's feelings, transform them and direct them so that they may all become disciplined. That idea that human nature is evil isn't in the Analects. Confucius is kind of
Well,
ambiguous.
you know what? Yes, Confucius is kind of ambiguous here. A lot of people, by reading Mengsel, by reading Mencius, believe that Confucius was as well really let's say idealistic on human nature, on humans are good by nature and so on and so forth. But Confucius was not very as simplistic, I think, as Mencius here. Okay, Confucius was a little bit ambiguous, but he certainly didn't believe that human nature was good. Okay, he believed that we had elements of good and elements of bad. Okay, this is more or less my interpretation of it. He believed that we have both, okay, but that we need to stress through moral cultivation the good side.
Yeah, and I think again, like the emphasis on like this metaphor of the wind and the grass. He's really prioritizing practice over some sort of essential human nature. He doesn't seem to have a rigid concept of human nature. It seems to be very much downstream of what the people above us do.
It's a later idea, and it caught on. Junzi had an apprentice, Han Fei, and he wasn't a Confucian. He was a legalist. The legalists
But
were
he
a group
didn't
of
see
thinkers
himself
who
as
didn't
being
have
one,
time.
like they didn't see. It is debated whether or not they saw themselves as being the legalist. Okay, the Confucians did see themselves more or less as being Confucians, but the legalists not so much. Okay, this is more of a latter, categorization of these thinkers as legalists. Okay, this is a contentious topic, but that is more or less my opinion there.
For all this virtue and wisdom shit. That's not how you run a country. You run a country by running it with laws and agriculture and crossbows. What is called wisdom consists of subtle and unfathomable doctrines. Such subtle and unfathomable doctrines are difficult even for men of the highest intelligence to understand. If what men of the highest intelligence find to be difficult to understand is used to make laws for the people, the people will find them impossible to understand.
Can you
The
stop it there for a
legalists
second?
said,
For a very
forget
short
about
second.
setting a good example.
This is a good quote from Han Feize, because it represents to some extent what Han Feize's criticism of Confucianism is. So it's a really, it is a systematized critique. Okay, it is a systematized one. It has different premises. One of those I already outlined, and this is more or less the conclusion. Okay, so this is a set of really abstract, rules and really abstract moral sentiments that in reality are really hard to comprehend and to actually be felt by even the brightest and the most benevolent of minds. So why should we be trying to rule based on those? We should try to rule based on, a set of systematized, of concrete laws that should not be violated, whatever. And the purpose of those goals should be to enhance the state, to enhance the potential and the capabilities of the state, to improve the state. Okay, not even any individual contingent goals. Okay, it is the state primarily. Even Han Feize himself did not see himself as being above the state. Okay, he was, in a sense, purely, strictly subservient to the state. And in fact, there's a story about Han Feize and the way in which he died and so on and so forth, because he died young as well. And many other legalists also have similar stories, okay, that he was unable to break his own rules. Okay, this is a story. Okay, I'm not gonna say it, but even he was unable, and Shang Yang, who was the legalist before him, so to say, they weren't able to break their own rules either. Okay, so it is about the rules. Those are strict authoritarian. Okay, unlike Confucius.
A ruler rules a country with two things: reward and punishment. Mainly punishment. They wanted an end to this
Not
endless
mainly, but
bickering between states. We need one strong central authority to keep everyone in line and make everything nice and simple. Now, we, in the freedom-loving, milk-drinking, individualistic 21st century, might look back and say, how on earth could they ever have thought that was a good idea?
The Chinese never had a secular enlightenment, which is why they had an iron-fisted empire, instead of the friendly kind of nice empire that we had.
But, of course, the legalists didn't see it that way. They thought of it in terms of accuracy and practicality and efficiency. We want to actually win battles by attacking when we're ready instead of waiting for our opponent. We want laws that actually apply to everybody. We want standardized weights and measurements and a standardized alphabet so everybody knows where they stand. We've seen what happens when rulers try to do the virtuous Confucian they go low, we go high thing. All it takes is a handful of clowns like the bloody G family to decide they're going to obstruct everything until they get their way, and the whole system collapses. So no more basing your ideas on ancient rituals or sage kings. Let's get some goddamn results. And they did. The state of Qin really took this stuff on board. And when society eventually collapsed enough to enter what historians call the Warring States period, the king of Qin kicked everyone's ass and united the states into a single new country, which he called Qin. Nice and simple, easy to pronounce. I bet no one's ever going to get that wrong. And then, now officially the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, he said, folks, we're going to build a wall.
Qin Shi Huang. The pronunciation. But yeah, it's a minor point.
A beautiful great wall on our northern border, and I am going to make Mongolia pay for that wall. And then he died. And F. Bia Xi Zhenshong.
The Qin dictatorship only lasted 15 years. They were very unpopular, and they pretty swiftly got booted out and roundly vilified by history. But not before. They killed a lot of Confucian scholars and burned a lot of
There's
books.
a little
So
echo. Can you hear it? I can hear a little bit of echo on my side.
Should be better now.
Okay.
What happened? What happened to inspiration and virtue and setting a good example? Why didn't it work? I mean, to be fair, Confucius did have a massive impact on the rest of Chinese history, to the point where even into the 20th century, Chinese philosophers were writing their ideas as commentaries
No,
on
but see, this
Confucius.
is the thing. Okay, can you stop it for a second? The fall of the Qing Empire was seen more as a failure of the legalists rather than the Confucians. In fact, the Confucians took it as an example of how societies that are only, focused on the rules and on enforcing them, regardless of whether or not there's benevolence, that those societies are going to last for short. This is what the quote that I showed from Confucius, right? What are the rights worth without benevolence? Okay, sure, maybe they can last for a couple of decades. They won't last for long. Okay, a society where people are just forced to do things, the second that the forces weaken, those people are not going to do those things anymore. Those people are going to fall out of line. That is the main point of Confucius, is we need to prioritize the moral sentiments because those are more durable than the rights, than the rules. Okay, those are actually more durable and they're stronger. And this is one of the things that Zizek, for example, says in one of his I think in one of his books. Okay, he makes this point, right, that the most authoritarian of two potential authorities is not one that simply gives you a set of rules and tells you, okay, this is what you have to do, because you can rebel against that, and the second that authority is taken down, you can immediately start doing whatever you want. The strongest of authorities is one where there is a set of rules, a defined set of rules, and the deep moral personal commitment to actually go ahead and do those things. Okay, and the example that he gives is really good. Is think about a father that wants you to go to your grandmother's house and give her a kiss. Okay, who is given a stronger, more profound order? The one that says you should go there, I don't care how you feel, just go there and give your grandmother a kiss, or the one that says, oh no, you know how much your grandmother loves you. Are you aware of how much your grandmother loves you? Why would you not go there and give her a kiss? Both things are asking you to do the exact same thing, although one is stronger because it's not only telling you what you need to do, but how you need to feel about it.
Weren't you nursed by your mother for 3 years? Exactly.
Yes.
But at the same time, the Zhou dynasty did not survive. Modern Chinese philosophers, especially since the Cultural Revolution, have asked, is Confucius still relevant? And hey, I'm not a historian, but one thing that does stand out to me is that Confucius' system is very moralistic. He's like, hey, things will get better if we can just raise awareness and get people to behave more morally. And the way we do that is with the rituals. So it's worth asking, if everybody on planet Earth woke up tomorrow and was like 50% more moral, whatever that means, right? Like more compassionate, less quick to anger, more concerned with the welfare of others, however you want to cash it out. Tomorrow morning, everybody wakes up like 50% better. Would that actually solve the problems? Would that solve global warming? Would it solve homelessness or police brutality and the rise of fascism? I mean, don't get me wrong, it might make people more inclined to do the things that would help, but then why don't we just focus on doing those things?
But that's critically important. So Confucius seems to be ambiguous as to like a state of emergency, right? But your capacity to address a state of emergency depends on the cooperation of the people under you.
Yes, so I think here that that is a good point. Okay, which is if we want to be able to solve today's problems applying Confucian philosophy, we should be aware that it is not just benevolence that is going to get us where we want to go. And this is why I was saying before that the right solution is the communist solution, is we should develop the material forces of society to the extent where we can live the Confucian principles, where we can actually have them be the ones that dictate our engagement with other people. But at certain times, we're going to have to make sacrifices. We're going to have to make certain judgments that are not necessarily the most Confucian ones. That is, I think, more or less the synthesis here.
Yeah,
But nevertheless, I see myself as a Confucian because I understand that it is really important to have those moral sentiments.
Yeah, and I think, again, like in those terms, one of the things that Marxism seeks to reclaim again is, again, the fading away of the state and the revitalization of local concrete communities with actual people. Not sort of an abstract individualism where you have no concrete care for basically anybody outside of your immediate friend group. I feel like she's kind of missing the point here, because Confucianism, again, isn't meant to address a single state of emergency. It's meant to address health.
Confucius was living himself in a state of emergency, right? He was
Right.
living also at a time of great turmoil. But
Yeah.
the point is that he had a good point,
Mhm.
but I believe that the legalists also had a good point as well. Han Fitze also had a good point.
Yeah. Well, it was the relationship to time, again, is so radically different, because there is no state of emergency for ancient China. A state of emergency relies on very fast communications and consequences resulting from those quick communications. In this case, there is no sharp distinction between that and our capacity to radically alter the environment very, very quickly. And what makes it an emergency is that we have a capacity to respond to that also very, very quickly. And there's a moment of decision that we have to act on efficiently. And of course, not adopting Confucianism, but sort of abiding by this model of sort of inculcating sort of a virtuous regard for the whole and social norms deriving from that regard, or something along those lines. That won't solve any individual state of emergency, but it also seems like an essential part to getting people on board for a common cause that extends beyond individual benefit. Because the problem with global warming isn't that it's not necessarily something that, I mean, maybe it is at this point, but it's not something that we can't address. It's something that no individual has in their best interests now to address, because addressing it comes at great cost. So that seems like there's a direct connection between what Confucius was arguing for, at least something approximating thereto, and a solution to the kinds of emergencies that Abigail is referring to here. But let's wrap this up.
I mean, to be fair to the Grandmaster, that is a very modern criticism. It's informed by hundreds of years worth of theory and evidence that he didn't have access to, so it's kind of cheating, but it is something that just stood out to me. Presumably, people in Confucius's time were sick of the state of things, the way that a lot of us are sick of it now. Politicians being openly corrupt and hypocritical, rich people not doing their fair share, elites looking the other way when someone breaks the rules, but it's one of their friends who does it. We go through the rituals, but it doesn't seem to work anymore, and there don't seem to be any consequences for those that don't. And Confucius's response was to try and breathe life back into the rituals, to get people to reinvest in them, give them a story about their lives and a place in the world that they could connect to. And it maybe didn't work out the way that he wanted it to, but yeah,
this strikes me as unfair. First of all, I don't like the idea that we've sort of escaped Confucius by means of an aggregate of accumulating theory, but also I don't think, again, like to go back to what you were saying before, the rituals had a particular functional role in Chinese culture. It wasn't just that he thought reinvigorating the rituals qua rituals would do this. It's that the rituals had a direct connection with the way in which people relate to one another in a filial sense. I don't know. It doesn't seem like a modern, it seems like she's dipping into the same chauvinism that she was critiquing earlier, which is a bit disappointing.
Philosophy doesn't have to work for it to be illuminating or for it to be responding to a genuine emotional need. I feel like if nothing else, there's something comforting in knowing that you are not the first person to live through times like these.
Yeah, Greasy colors on my plate.
You kind of are, though. Kind of are, though. Well,
What is the takeaway?
I don't know, because she started off saying, like, look, this is really relevant to today's world. And then at the end of it, she's like, no, it's not. No, he just wants to reinvigorate ancient Chinese rituals. And that's not going to solve global climate change. So that's all she had. And it's like really? It was so strong for the first. I mean, it was even good, honestly, like better than I remembered it in the latter point. Like she made some good points. But then at the end of it, she just treats it as discardable, effectively. It's like, oh, hey, you know what? You can feel good because Confucius, he lived through some crap too. But that's so meaningless.
I think that she takes Han Feitze and she sees Han Feitze's, let's say, critiques of Confucianism, and she, in a sense, becomes too embedded into those critiques, and then stops looking at the deeper message, which I don't think she even got that well. Okay, which is the fact that you need, in order to sustain the rituals, in order to sustain social order, you need to have those moral sentiments. Okay, even if you for a time can sustain a society and make it very big and make it, a really strong society only by pure force and by pure pragmatism, even then, if you're not able to sustain, to guarantee a certain level of humanity within your population, that society is going to disintegrate at some point. It's going to be, let's say, overcome by another one that is stronger than yours, or maybe not so strong.
Maybe this is less interesting, but I'm just thinking in terms. Again, I'm so baffled by how this argument progresses, because it starts off in one place, projects what its thesis is going to be by the end of it, and then never arrives. And it almost feels a little bit like what must have happened.
She kind of arrives there, she kind of arrives at the thesis, because initially she says Confucius had a solution to the problem. And then at some point in the middle of the video, she says that Confucius' solution was to teach the powerful, the gentlemen, to be gentlemen, so that they can, in a sense, motivate other people to be gentlemen themselves.
Yeah. And I agree.
But
this
is not really, this is, I think, too idealistic of an interpretation. It's not fully wrong, but it's too idealistic, I think.
That's her characterization of what Confucius wanted to do. But before that, she says that Confucius is relevant. And I think she argued ultimately for the opposite of that. She argued that it wasn't relevant, except as it's sort of like a quaint, I don't even know what to characterize it. Like Confucius should not warm the cockles of your heart. But I think what I feel like must have happened, and again, like I'm falling back on this because this is the kind of thing that I find really interesting with. I don't even want to call this a bad philosophy video, because there was some good stuff in here. I think it was a mixed bag, but I think it was worth it all told, which is more than I can say for some of her stuff. I think this was actually fairly solid, all things considered.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like when you're an undergraduate and you're introduced to Plato for the first time. Say you read Plato's Republic in a first year political science or philosophy course, and all of a sudden you're a Platonist. And then the next year you read Aristotle and you're an Aristotelian. And then you go through the motions. I feel like that's what happened with this as was being made. I think she read Confucius. Oh, interesting. Wrote down the Confucius. Read critiques, and then became all of a sudden
But you know what Hegel's solution is? You know what Hegel's solution is? You know what Hegel says?
Don't ask me that. I'm not that good at Hegelian.
Well, I think so. I'm not a Hegelian, like a strict, Hegelian scholar, but I would say that Hegel's solution would be more or less to say that yes, both aspects of that argument, okay, both aspects of that dialectic were the ones that got us to a synthesis where we are now, okay, which is the one that I tried to present there with communism, right? That was the synthesis that I tried to present. So when he was discussing Plato, he wasn't discussing Plato in the sense of he was completely debunked by Aristotle, and then after that, Plato is wrong, is worthless. We just focus on a different one. Plato was onto something, and then came Aristotle, and now we have a synthesis of both.
Yeah, well, it's like the initial theory, the one that is being grown, it contains its opposite within itself. So it's not so much a dissolution of earlier theory; it's kind of an unfolding of the theory.
Exactly.
Yeah. Slubbergully says if someone read Plato and became a Platonist, then read Aristotle and became an Aristotelian, they would remain a Platonist. I'm not sure if I agree with the sense of that, but yeah, basically. What was your takeaway? What did you think of this?
Well, I mean, I think that the main takeaway is that whenever you're trying to do pop philosophy, it is not bad, okay, to do pop philosophy of trying to, of getting philosophy out to people that are not necessarily philosophers, and in a way that is approachable, that is easy to understand. When you do it, you need to be more careful, okay? I think that you should do it because there's different ways in which you can reach people, and this is certainly one, and it is a really effective one. But if you really want to get the points across and you want to engage in really solid philosophical thinking, even if it's not the highest quality philosophical thinking, but if you want to get to a good discussion level, to a good level of discussion, you should pay a little bit more of attention to the original sources, to the things, okay? Because I think that the main problem here was that the point with the Lee and the Jen, okay, and then how she completely and how she read Handfates and then thought, well, then Confucianism, at the beginning of the video, maybe it was helpful and all of that, but actually, you know what? Maybe Handfates had a point there, and this is all just like abstract moralizing, talking that we shouldn't really take into too much consideration because we really need to solve prescient issues today,
Yeah.
But you should be a little more careful, a little bit more careful.
I think you put your finger on something really important, and this is again sort of the irony. I think you can do a philosophical analysis badly, and there still be value in it if you create fascination with the writer, such that people are inclined to investigate themselves. I think the worst thing she does is at the end is she dissolves whatever interest she generated by saying that, you know what, this can't address, really interesting and really pressing problems today. And that is hugely irresponsible. And ironically enough, this is me personally, this is my biggest critique of Peterson. It's not the inconsistency of his arguments. It's that he will let's say he'll talk about Foucault and he'll say, well, Foucault just wanted to assert communism by other means. It was just a slippery little ideological double agent. Because he characterizes him in that way, people approach Foucault with suspicion and bad faith, and they don't read him and try to understand him. Same with his treatment of Marx, same with his treatment. I don't know if he treats Hegel, but you know what I mean. And
yes.
It's that's what she did here. She told people effectively, hey guys, this is really interesting, but don't take it too seriously because he really can't help us at all. There's really nothing of interest here. And it makes me reevaluate now actually my whole how much I appreciate this video, because again, it did a really good job early on of generating fascination, but then it reduced it to just sort of a trivial artifact. And that's just, I don't know, it's disappointing. And I think if people take that last bit away, and hopefully they don't, but if people take the last bit away, that's actually destructive of philosophy. So.
Yeah, I mean, I agree pretty much entirely with your sentiment here, because I think, and this is the point, right, that I was getting at. When you're doing pop philosophy, it's good. Okay, you should do it because I want to diversify the ways in which we reach people and teach them important things. But you shouldn't, in a sense, shoot yourself in the foot by presenting those things in a way that is interesting, and then in the end saying, you know what, maybe this wasn't that interesting all along.
Yeah.
I think that we should take Confucius a little bit more seriously, and we should take the entire Confucian framework more seriously. And it is complicated and it is dense, and certain parts are really, immaterial in the sense of they're really concerned only with the good, the characters, the moral character, and the moral sentiments, and so on and so forth. But I do believe that there is worth in those, and there is worth in reading that, and in learning those, and in being,
Yeah.
more moral and more,
And what you'll yeah. And again, like if you approach this and you pick this up and you're just kind of baffled, like what is this? Isn't philosophy, it's just saying things. Again, like you have to, if you read about books about Chinese philosophy, what it's really emphasized is that the genre of philosophical writing is really what's distinct here. The activity of philosophy, insofar as we're not being super hyper modern and specific and excluding like huge swaths of traditional Western philosophy. The activity of philosophy is taking place behind the text. The text itself implies philosophical argumentation. It's definitely enriched by reading somebody like Aristotle, who goes directly into his reasoning process for how he arrives ultimately at very similar places as Confucius in a lot of ways, especially in book 2 of the Politics or book 7. It's one of the Education, I can't remember, but I think it's both actually. But it's just a damn shame, because if she cuts off the very end of this video, it's actually really good. And yeah, but anyways, we've been going for we're going close to 3 hours now, 2.5 hours.
2 hours and a half, yeah.
Let's call it
Go to
here.
questions.
Blood clots. We can do this again.
So we're not answering questions this time?
Did you want to answer questions? We can absolutely.
I mean, I don't know if there are questions here. I didn't see them, but
well, let me take a look. Oh, you know what? There actually was one that I saw. That was directed to you, actually. From Novins and Hosek, for Victor, relative to what was said, who overthrow the Qins?
The Qings, the Han Dynasty, the Han Dynasty. So I mean, the story of how the Qing was the Qing Dynasty was overthrown is complex, and it has different stages. It has a little bit of betrayals here and there, but the Han Dynasty was the one that, in a sense, came after the Qing. Okay.
Yeah. And then somebody asked me if I was familiar with Cool Stuff asked President Sunday, do you know anything about distributism? I haven't looked into it in depth. Obviously, G.K. Chesterton is the most famous representative of that political philosophy or theory or whatever. My general impression of it, I'm not impressed by its advocates, not enough to look too deeply into it. Maybe I will at some point in the future, but it seems really a way of getting at socialist ends without doing the hard work of the hard analytical work that socialists did. I'm not hostile to it, but it seems it seems a little bit silly, to be totally honest with you. It doesn't seem like it's a very serious thing. There's again, like Chesterton and whatnot, he was a very clever writer, but there's a reason why he's not taken seriously in political theory. He just wasn't engaging seriously with people in that discipline. And of course, he had some contempt in whatever a nice, cute way he performed it. He was very mocking of people who in sort of the socialist sphere. So I'm just generally not that impressed. But let's see what else is there. If anybody has any questions quickly, we can go through those, but I think otherwise we'll wrap it up. I have to replace my chair. This thing is killing me. I got my vaccine last month, and I've just been noticing, you see me fidgeting constantly. Just every joint in my body hurts after that. They are not lying. It does cause mass inflammation everywhere. It's not that bad. It's just when you're sitting at a desk all day, it gets uncomfortable. Yeah, I'm not really seeing any other questions here. So I think we'll, if you're all right, I think we'll call it now. And yeah, this was fun. Should do this again.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad that Sunday is magnetized. I'm glad that this video wasn't. God, this is better than Libertarian Scott. At least there was
much
something.
much better. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when we were talking about Lauren Chen and Libertarian Scott, moving to this feels like an improvement, like a solid improvement.
Yeah.
Because he's certainly not at that level of Lauren Chen and Scott. But anyway, Scott never accepted. So he continues, okay, in that thread of comments.
Yeah.
In his video on me, he continues to reply to other people, and he even replied at some point today to me, to a message that I sent like
Yeah.
days ago, and I said to him, like, what about the debate? We even talked about this in Twitter, and you're yet to answer. But he doesn't want to answer. He doesn't want to answer.
Well, because he knows he knows he's out of his depth.
He doesn't want to answer the question whether you're going to debate it or not. You
Which
know
is
how
probably
we
wise.
indirectly, so we tried to bait him by saying, are you confident in your position? And then follow up with the question, well, if you're confident, then you should debate. And then he answered the first question and didn't answer the second one. So he said, I'm 100% confident in my position. And
Yeah.
then to the second question, which is, okay, if you're 100%, are you willing to defend it? He never gave a reply to the second one. So debate didn't work with him.
So Libertarian Scott, my doors are open. If you want to come in and you want to give Victor what for, I will be more than happy to accommodate that. I would very much like him to look less handsome than me on stream in future. So with that, let's call it. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you, Victor. That was very educational for me as well. Much better than last time. Oh my God. But yeah, take care. Ciao. Have a good night. Cherish the small things. Arrivederci.